We have an NHL insider reporting that the NHL has made a lot of progress preparing for its potential return and might very well be going with the 24-team playoff format. We'll discuss how all this might work coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned earlier today, we had information from NHL Insider, a member of the TSN as well as the Athletic, Pierre LeBrun, put this following information out here on Twitter, which I'll show you on the screen. But essentially, he's saying the NHL Return to Play Committee has been meeting a lot over the weekend, and it looks as though they've made a lot of progress towards a potential plan if they're able to come back and play the remainder of the season. Looks as though there's a lot of momentum being built towards a 24-team playoff round. So that tells me that they more than likely would probably scrap the remainder of the regular season, go directly into a playoff format, and 24 teams out of 31 would be included. So obviously that would break down to have 12 teams per conference. Now, this information on Twitter also goes in to say that they very well could have an announcement next week sometime, and that very well announcement could be around the NHL Draft as well. Now, also mentions here that there's still a lot of work to be done, and this is far from a guarantee, but this is the latest information being provided by his inside sources that where the NHL is heading and what direction we're likely going to see if they're able to come back and have a playoff round to award the 2020 Stanley Cup. Now, as we previously discussed as well, there's been a lot of talk about having a June draft, but then there seemed to be a lot of resistance from various clubs around it, so it's not quite clear how that's going to work, but as time goes on here, it's getting less and less likely that we'd see a June draft. As we've indicated before, the NHL has said it's going to need at least a month to prepare, so the further we get into May without an announcement just leads us to think that they probably won't be having one. And really, I think if they're getting closer on determining the return to play rules, and obviously they're going to have to determine where they can safely play and how that's all going to work. I'm sure a lot of that work's probably being done behind the scenes already that we just don't have information on publicly as of yet. That they very well wouldn't surprise me, as I mentioned a few times before, that they very well could make an announcement all at one time with their return plan, how it's all going to work, how it's going to impact the draft lottery, the playoff format, and just get it all laid out here in one fell swoop. So obviously, if 24 teams out of 31 return, that means 7 teams would not be returning to action. So those teams will obviously be in the draft lottery. They'd be the bottom 7 teams. So let's take a look now at how the first round of the playoffs would work in a 24-team format. So as I mentioned, we'd have 12 teams per conference qualify for the playoffs. Obviously, the top 4 teams in each conference would get a bye past the first round. So those teams would be in the following here. In the Eastern Conference, we'd have the Boston Bruins, the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Washington Capitals, and the Philadelphia Flyers. So they would all automatically qualify for round 2 and get a bye. The Western Conference would see the St. Louis Blues, the Colorado Avalanche, the Edmonton Oilers, and the Vegas Golden Knights. Be those 4 teams, they'd all get a bye past round 1. Now, this would also produce some very interesting matchups for round 1. Now, of course, we don't know exactly how the series would be set up. I can't imagine the first round will be a best out of 7, probably a best out of 3 or best out of 5. I'm not sure exactly what format they will go with, but clearly the NHL is going to want to have this timed out so we get a good amount of hockey, get a good amount of games so they can make up some of the lost revenue, but at the same time try to crunch things down so it doesn't take forever either. So it's certainly going to be condensed. I would think round 1 could very well be as short as a best out of 3. I guess we'll have to wait for an announcement to get any kind of certainty. But here's the round 1 matchup. So basically the other 8 teams in each conference would essentially be seeded 1 through 8, which is basically going to put you at teams 5 versus 12, 6 versus 11, 7 versus 10, and 8 versus 9. That gives us matchups of the Pittsburgh Penguins against the Montreal Canadiens. The Carolina Hurricanes would battle the Florida Panthers. The Toronto Maple Leafs would battle the New York Rangers. And the Columbus Blue Jackets would battle the New York Islanders in the Eastern Conference, where we'd have the Dallas Stars against the Chicago Blackhawks in the West in round 1. The Jets versus the Coyotes, that'd be a really fun series. You'd have the new Jets versus the old Jets, essentially. That certainly had some interesting storylines to it. You'd have the Flames versus the Wild, and the Predators versus the Vancouver Canucks. So then essentially your 8 teams that are going to be out and after the round 1, that would make up the remainder of your teams in the lottery. You already have 7 teams that didn't qualify. You now have 8 more teams that are eliminated. That gives you the top 15, which you can hold your draft lottery, which they could very well, if they decide to push the draft back, which wouldn't surprise me at this point, they could have the draft lottery during the second round of the playoffs, which would be kind of like the old first round on the old format. And it's just kind of what we would have been normally used to seeing before. Usually in the first week or so of the Stanley Cup playoffs, they have the draft lottery for the teams that didn't make it. So it's kind of a similar format if they went that road. So then essentially you'd have the 4 teams from the East that got a bye versus the 4 teams that won. And then of course that would make up your new matchups. They'd be reseeded 1 through 8. And you'd carry on from there until you eventually got yourself a Stanley Cup winner. So of course if they decide to push the draft back, they could do the draft lottery like I said during round 2. Hold the draft shortly after the Cup's awarded, which is hard to say exactly when that would be. But we'll talk about timelines here momentarily, and then you still have time for free agency and everything else. As we said before, the NHL is certainly willing to delay the start of the 2020-21 season in order to complete the 19-20 season in order to get the Stanley Cup awarded. If I had to put my best guess on timelines, here's what I would say. We're currently May the 17th today as I record this video. I would say that if we get an announcement sometime late next week, very well they might say that NHL players need to be back into their NHL cities possibly by June the 1st, let's say. If that's the case, they're likely, many of them will have to go into self-isolation for 14 days because of the travel restrictions and the rules around throughout Canada and the U.S. and where everybody is based out of here. So clearly that could give them 2 weeks to get back. And then by middle of June, we could have some training camps open up once everybody's through their isolation period and have them ready for playoffs come early July. And then from there, you'd play throughout July and August, maybe into part of September, depending on how long everything takes. You're probably looking at about a 45 to 55 day break after that season before the next one could start. So let's say they award the Stanley Cup sometime, possibly say middle of September. Then you're probably looking at somewhere around a late November, early December start time. They very well could push it back till January if they wanted to, depending on what they want to go with, but they probably wouldn't have to go that long if they can get going in July. Just kind of depends on the timing here. This is just my best guess. Once the Stanley Cup's awarded, you could shortly after that have the NHL Draft. You could have an NHL award session, and then you could also allow a month or so of free agency and trades and everything like that before they would get camps going on the following season. So certainly some very interesting information from Pierre LeBrun today. We've seen different formats talked about, discussed before. Some have more momentum than others, but you got to remember here, they got to be creative. They're trying to make up lost revenues. Clearly, having a 24-team playoff round, it certainly would be a little bit more interesting in a lot of markets compared to having a 16-team or a 20-team playoffs. I mean, that gets more teams in the mix, like Montreal, the Rangers, Chicago, some big markets with big fan bases. And as much as some other fans of other teams might be annoyed by that, it's simply a business. It comes down to money. And the more teams they can have in the mix here, they kind of create a buzz to kind of help with TV ratings and possibly sell some merchandise, would be good for making up some lost revenues within the NHL. And instead of having some teams with some big fan bases and long histories involved, certainly would go a very long way. So that's why I think they're looking at that. And instead, obviously, they could have all 15 teams for the draft lottery concluded after round 1, after the play-in round is completed. So let me know what your thoughts are here on this 24-team playoff system. You think this is the right move? Let me know what your thoughts are down below in the comment section. We can discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.